British Navy when they discovered about 150 years before they actually made a policy change. Fortunately, the sailors who were dying didn't take that long to take action, but to see actual change from knowledge into the policy process can be very, very long. So we did take the long view, not 150 years. IDRC has been around less than 40 years. But we did take the long view. And so we looked at some projects that we had started funding about 18 years before the start of this study. So some of the projects had quite a long, long tail to them. We also thought we should take a broad range of projects on a wide range of subject areas and in a wide range of countries. We thought we would see overlaps and see patterns that would help us propose factors that could help other researchers to set the conditions for their own findings to be used in the future. And we did this through a study that's based on 23 rich case studies of policy influence from around the developing world. The cases are all summarized in the book, so you get at least a sample within the text of what some of the key issues were in each of the studies. And for IDRC, these case studies were important because for those of you who don't know the International Development Research Center, our mandate is to support building capacity for research in the Global South and supporting research on problems in the Global South. So the case studies were really the research that was going on. IDRC itself doesn't do research. It actually supports others to do research. So we are a step removed in that process. But we wanted to know how we could improve our support, and we wanted to see what information, ideas, tacts could we provide to researchers that could help them in the future. So I wanted in the next few minutes to highlight two of the main findings from this study. But before I do that, I wanted to make two comments on methodology for the study. The first is that comparison is the hallmark of really good evaluation. Some even call it the platinum standard for evaluation. And this, with 23 case studies, we have a strong base for comparison. It could certainly be stronger if there were other studies going on, or if we could do the study again in 5 years' time and have that comparison over time. But we think we have a pretty good foundation as we stand. The second point I wanted to make is that the study started with success in a critical way. It started with a positive sample of projects and a third microphone. So a positive sample of projects where we found projects where people within IDRC felt that there had been some kind of policy influence. Often in evaluation we end up focusing on the negative, but in this case we thought a positive focus could actually be very instructive in helping us unpack what happens in the policy influence process so other people could make use of the ideas for the future. I wanted to focus on two main highlights. And the first is context. I want to talk a bit about environment. John used the word environment. That figures out strongly in this study and in the findings. And then a few words on exploiting contingencies. And what I mean by that is the institutional and political variables that researchers have to fine-tune their influence strategies against. And in both of these cases, these are things that researchers can't directly control. But how they work with that environment is critical, and the articulation of these factors is meant to enhance the capacities of researchers to understand their setting and to work effectively within it. So context matters, and what you have on the slide in front of you is really the 5 contexts I'm going to talk to. And I think this is really one of the most interesting sets of findings on this study, and it's one that's been used quite extensively within IDRC already. Context or environment is certainly messy, it's uncertain, and it's difficult to capture in ways that we can actually make effective use of it. We often put our success or our failure down to context or the environment. Well, it happened. It happened because of things that were outside of our control, so we don't really have a thorough understanding of it. And we treat it as a bit of a black box. What we did was illuminate that black box in some useful ways. So the 23 case studies came out really with these 5 contexts emerging across a number of the case studies. And clearly how the researchers acted in each of those settings is different if they were going to be successful. it had an effect on the nature of the relationships that they had. How they communicated was affected. Where they put their efforts was changed. And I'll come back to that with a few examples. But really what we found is that for researchers to really maximize the influence that they're having, they really needed to understand the context within which they were operating, and they also needed to understand that that context could change, and it could often change quite dramatically over time, so they needed always to be attuned to what the environment was and what factors were changing and what conditions were changing. So let me go through these briefly. The first is where there's policymaker demand. For researchers, this is in many ways the best of all possible worlds. You actually have somebody asking you for your advice, asking you for your data and your knowledge to help them make a decision. But it does require two things of the researchers we found in our study. First of all, they must have already existing trusting relationships built on a reputation for conducting solid research. And secondly, they need to have anticipated the demand in advance, because there's nothing...
Just try holding the microphone a bit closer.
A bit closer. Okay. Okay. It's an experiment. Life is an experiment. Okay, so the second thing that they have to have in place is that they have to have anticipated demand in advance. Because there's really nothing worse for a researcher when a policymaker comes calling to have to say, give me a year to do the research, and then I can give you the answer to your question. They're not willing to wait. They're going to move on, and you've lost the opportunity. But with these two provisos, clearly the potential for policy influence is the highest in this context of any of the contexts that are outlined here. And we saw it appear most often in new policy contexts where major transitions were underway of some sort. Major transitions in government or major transitions in terms of a new or emerging field of study. For example, the explosion of internet and wireless communication posed tremendous demands and problems for regulatory systems in many, many countries. And governments didn't have a history of dealing with this issue. They didn't know how to deal with it. So in many cases, were willing and able to turn to researchers for advice and ideas. And willing to turn to researchers much more so than in traditional fields of education or health, where they're expected to already know and to be able to make decisions. The second environment is that where there's policymaker interest in the problem. They know this is something they have to deal with, but there's a leadership gap. And by that, I mean that there is an institutional gap in the system. There's no home for a decision to be taken. There's no home for the data to get used within a system. So in this context, then, the researchers have to exercise a leadership role. They have to build relationships and focus attention on the institutional needs as well as on the research itself. In other words, beyond the research itself, an implementation plan is critical for the researchers to put into place. Third context is fairly similar, where there's policymaker interest, but here the gap is one of resources. They know they have to deal with the issue, but they really don't have the resources to deal effectively with that issue. So the implementation challenge here is different. Again, the institutional questions remain. So the institutional structures are often missing, but the priority of the issue has to be increased, and it has to be moved up the policy agenda so resources are actually diverted to deal with this particular problem. And that brings a number of different communication strategies and advocacy strategies to bear. So the fourth context in which policymakers are neutral and where researchers are really interested in the problem is probably the most common one in the research world. And that's not surprising in the sense that researchers are often struggling with questions that nobody has really dealt with yet. They're trying to figure out a problem that is emerging. Researchers try to be ahead of the curve in defining issues. So clearly it's also a very challenging position from which to create influence, because policymakers are really neutral, they're unaware of the problem, aren't dealing with it in any particular way. But what we did see was a number of the projects succeeded in that influence, more or less. Not all of them succeeded, and I'll show you a chart of that in a minute. But what we saw in the success was success in building relationships, but not only with decision makers, relationships with communities and interested publics who would advocate for the issue on behalf of themselves and on behalf of the researchers, and communications with the press. So a whole range of communication strategies became much more important, and linkages between researchers and effective communicators became extremely important. We also saw strong advocacy skills and an ability to mobilize public opinion. And more particularly, I think we saw a good understanding among those who were successful of understanding who should be influenced and how to mobilize the appropriate resources for influence. The fifth and final context, and you can see where this is going away from the strong potentials for influence, is where researchers remain interested in an issue, but policymakers are really largely disinterested in what's going on. Sometimes they could even be hostile. So this represents really a failure of the effort to influence policy. But that doesn't mean the issue is not important. It means that the issue and the timing haven't lined up very effectively at this stage. And what we see here is researchers who are persistent, who are patient, stay with the issue, looking for any moment when they can seize an opening in order to put forward the idea yet again. So they show a lot of patience and persistence to bring the issue to the table another day. This slide and the next one really show you our case studies. Now, all the acronyms on there don't matter very much for the purposes of our discussion. What this is saying is that we've identified each of our cases at the beginning of the project as to how it laid out against these contexts, from those where there was clear demand, particularly in the information and communication technology projects, all the way down to those where there was disinterest in the process. And I highlighted the projects that fall in the fourth environment in a different color here because I wanted to show you the change over time. This is the condition at the start of projects. So working from the project documents, the proposals, the conditions that were discussed by the program officers in approving the project, we identified how these mapped onto these policy contexts. We then did the same thing at the end of each of the projects to see what had changed. And the startling change is to see that the projects where there was an attempt to influence policy, where there was not much knowledge or interest among the policymakers, actually all moved in some direction or other. Some of them moved up to some degree, some of them moved right up to actually have clear policy demand coming back to the project, and others didn't succeed. They didn't succeed for a range of reasons. I wanted to talk then for a couple of minutes about the second issue, the second set of findings, and that is about the importance of exploiting contingencies. And what are these? We identified 5 of these, again, as things that researchers have very little control over, but things that researchers need to consider in terms of thinking through an influence strategy. Because of the importance of relationships in policy influence, the nature and structure of decision-making institutions has to be taken account in thinking through policy influence. So when there's rapid turnover at the senior levels, it's extremely difficult for researchers to establish strong and effective relationships. By way of example, in Guatemala, in one of the projects, there was a sudden shift of power from the legislative to the executive branch of government, which left the researchers completely unprepared because they had no relationships or knowledge of how to deal with the executive branch. In the Ukraine, researchers coped with the institutional instabilities by focusing on 2 levels. One, the general public, who could then advocate and put forward changes. And secondly, the president, who was the only stable part of a fairly unstable system at the time of this project. In another way, the Latin American Trade Network dealt with this problem, where you had in Latin America the rapid turnover of governments through the life of many of these projects. So the senior levels of government were changing so much that the researchers couldn't work effectively with them. So they focused on the 3rd level down of the bureaucracy because that was the level at which there was some stability of actors in the system. And it's also where the revolving bureaucrats at the top of the system had to turn when they wanted advice on where was the system coming from and what were the ongoing issues that were being addressed. So mapping the characteristics of a system that you're trying to deal with is key. Secondly, weak government capacity clearly limits the use of research findings. Some of the cases we looked at worked to overcome this problem by working with decision makers as well as with researchers. In Senegal, the leader of a poverty research project spent quite a bit of time over a number of years informally advising government officials, providing them with information, and creating opportunities for exchange of ideas between the government and the opposition on an informal, off-the-record basis, and in that way developed a high level of trust among the decision makers, but also some experience and capacity in using ideas and using research in the decision process. So when needs emerged for research on poverty, the policymakers had some understanding of the research, what it could do, and they had trusting relationships with the researchers. In the Latin American Trade Network, they found they were simply spending a great deal of time educating policymakers, not only dealing with the research. So use of knowledge or influence in research is not only the purview of democratic systems, nor is it limited to either decentralized or highly centralized systems of government. What really matters is the alignment of the influence plan with the real-world structure of decision-making. Whatever the government system, research can have an influence, and we saw a range of examples in these projects. So in the Philippines, a highly decentralized system of government, where a poverty monitoring system was highly effective in helping one province, in the province of Palawan, there was a desire to expand the approach to other provinces. In this situation, that required a very intensive effort on a province-by-province basis to expand the ideas and extend the ideas out. So the decentralized nature of the system really had an effect on mobilization and implementation beyond the original setting. In Vietnam, by contrast, the economic research was outwardly consumed by a highly centralized system of government as it made the transition to a market-based economy. The last example of Vietnam highlights another important contingency, and that is that countries in transition offer special opportunities for influence. So where a major change is underway, the policymakers are much more alive to innovation and much more alive to unorthodox thought. They're more willing to admit a lack of knowledge and more willing to then seek research inputs. Countries in transition, however, are not always easy settings in which to work, and major advances and major setbacks can come very quickly and often from quite unexpected directions. Economic crisis or economic pressure is the final contingency I wanted to highlight. In most cases where government is receptive to research, government leaders are responding to an economic imperative. In Vietnam, for example, the policymakers were open because they were under pressure to come up with significant changes to a market-based system of economy. And in Senegal, the government came back to the researchers that I mentioned on poverty research because of demands external to the system, that is demands for a poverty reduction strategy process by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Contingencies change over time in any one setting. They merge, new ones come up, and new crises take hold. And the researchers, aside from understanding the context that they start, need to be alive to these changes and aware of these possible changes over time if they're going to continue to have success in their quest for policy influence. This study was in many ways about alignment, a word that's not often used in evaluation. I used alignment only once actually already in this presentation, but what I mean here is that we're not concerned so much with the individual results of each project, but rather with what and with how the projects as a whole made contributions to society. In terms of where this comes from and where it goes, as Maureen O'Neill notes in her preface to the book, research makes a major contribution to good governance in any society. It opens space for debate, it opens space for inquiry, and it empowers people with knowledge to hold their governments to account. It also enlarges the array of policy options that are open to decision makers. development research, as one particular kind of research, is crucially about change. It is about improving the lives of people and of communities through the use of knowledge. And so that makes development researchers themselves change agents. And this book is really about helping them try to improve their capacities by opening up the black box of the public policy decision process to improve scrutiny so that opportunities for influence are enhanced. Thank you.